Welcome to our lesson on Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. Let's start by giving credit where credit is due and talk a little bit about who Howard Gardner is.
The biggest mistake of past centuries in teaching has been to treat all children as if they were variants of the same individual and thus to feel justified in teaching them all the same subjects the same way. Howard Gardner.
Howard Gardner is a second-generation immigrant. His parents are Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. He was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and early on developed a passion and a giftedness as a pianist. I also read about his love for books and reading, that his passion and his giftedness in music was a big factor in his contribution of stepping outside of the black and white IQ box and into this non-uniform concept of human cognition. Gardner was a doctorate in developmental psychology and had academic appointments both in neurology and in education. In 1973, Gardner published Frames of Mind, and this is where he describes the theory of multiple intelligences. He proposes a more complex and more nuanced paradigm of intelligences that comprises 8 core intelligences. We're going to look into those. And what he's saying is we are comprised of all of those, not just this one and we just focus on this one, but we have pieces of all. Some might be little pieces, some might be bigger pieces. This really shifted the world of education and the way educators thought about education. We'll talk about that a little bit later about the benefits and the controversies when it comes to the theory of multiple intelligences. So to get us in this mind space of multiple intelligences before we move on to the lecture, let's reflect together. So I want you to reflect on a time when you learned something particularly well. It just stuck and it seemed to stick forever, whether in school, at work, life experiences. I would say for me, I have a lot more life experiences, experiences in my faith that have really stuck. But as I think about respiratory therapy, before I did respiratory, I did 10 years of chemistry and biochemistry. And to be honest, I felt like I didn't learn anything. I felt like I was just memorizing my entire life. Once I got to respiratory, I started learning. I started getting it. I started understanding. And as I think through this question and reflect, I think about the mechanical ventilator. And it feels like everything I learned actually stuck. So that takes us to the next question. What made that learning experience successful? Well, before I was just memorizing. Now I see the difference as incredible interest, a lot of kinesthetic learning with the patient. You're looking at the ventilator, you're touching it. But my biggest factor for me was because of that interest, I was reading. I loved Egan and I read through every word of it, and it just really stuck with me better. It gave me so much more context. Let's go through each of Gardner's 8 core intelligences. Visual spatial. This is the strength where people are good at visualizing the world in 3 dimensions. They're good at their spatial relations. They're great at the dishwasher. They're great at packing. Really have the ability to perceive the visual spatial world accurately. Linguistic and verbal. This is the ability to find the right words to be able to express what you mean. These people are sensitive to both spoken and written language. These are your readers, your writers. Next on our intelligence is interpersonal. Interpersonal is your relationship with other people. You're able to sense people's feelings, people's motives. You understand others well. It's the empathetic person. You're sensitive to others' moods, to others' motivations, their desires, and typically work well with others. Next, we have intrapersonal. Intrapersonal is that relationship with yourself, knowing yourself well, knowing your own desires, feelings, wants, being able to communicate those. Logical, mathematical. Here's a person that can quantify things, make hypotheses and work those out. Here's a person that lives here logically. They like math, investigate, they like science, investigate things scientifically, critical thinking, problem solving, reasoning, logic. Next on our list is musical. Remember, Howard Gardner had a strength in musical, and yet he was in the sciences and education. And I'm sure that musical intelligence was very helpful to bring in new perspectives. Musical is defined by being able to discern sounds, pitch, tone, rhythm. Body kinesthetic is that coordination with your mind and your body, your physical body. As I taught this course, I'll be honest, what I find about your respiratory therapist as I ask which one, so many body kinesthetic learners, at least that is their biggest strength, is that body kinesthetic. The body kinesthetic person uses their whole body as part of their problem solving and learning. Last one is the naturalistic. This one's defined by understanding living things and being able to read nature. This intelligence is the ability to recognize, categorize, see the patterns of the naturalized environment around us. We're really at risk of crossing that line of what it is not when we start putting these careers of natural intelligence should be a botanist, or a logical person should be a mathematician. The risk is siloing people into these categories or pigeonholing them, unfairly categorizing, belong in a spectrum. We're whole people. Okay, so we don't want to pigeonhole ourselves just by the one strength. That strength can be used in such a broad spectrum. And as we talked about respiratory therapy, I see a lot of kinesthetic people in there. Okay, but I see a lot of interpersonal people in there too that are so good with that interaction, or intrapersonal, that they have such a great reflection on who they are that they're able to engage at a more empathetic level with the patient. And I do have a strong logical mathematical, and I really understood that ventilator really well. It made a lot of sense to me on how it worked, so that obviously helped when I was at bedside. There are key concepts. Everyone possesses the full spectrum. Some stronger, some weaker. This is not a label. If you're strong in the body kinesthetic, that doesn't mean you should go be Michael Jordan. Though he might be a body kinesthetic guy. It's a growth mindset. You know, if you consider this like the pie chart on the first page, and we'll look at it at the next page, these areas can grow. These areas can shrink. It's just a strength and weakness based idea of intelligences. There's an interconnectedness. They all work together, like that respiratory therapist or those respiratory therapists that have lots of these different skills at different levels. Each learner has a unique blend. I'm going to show you mine in the next page. So I want you to think through your own pie chart. Create one. It can be in your mind. I'm not asking you to turn it in, but create one that is reflective of your strengths and your weaknesses. Maintain the full chart. Don't eliminate anything in there to maintain your full self. I want to show you mine. I actually made one. I used my 4-year-old's art supplies. By the way, mine looks different today than it did last year, especially than it did 5 years ago, especially than it did 20 years ago. So the biggest one, which I put at about 25% or a, 1/4. So my biggest strength I have as interpersonal. And also fairly large, I have intrapersonal. The other thing I'd like to point out here is my spatial relations. And it's pretty ironic because I actually didn't save space for my spatial relations to even write on it. As educators, it is important to know our students, to understand how they learn, to adapt our teaching strategies to support their success. This is often easier in a smaller setting, in that clinical setting where you just have some clinical students, two, three, one, or where you're one-on-one with a patient. This does get harder when you're talking about a larger classroom, 20, 30 students. In the smaller setting, we're tailoring our teaching style to meet their needs, build on their strengths, strengthen their weaknesses. Learning is a way of feeding yourself. It's one of those beautiful things that we're created to do. And if you think about when we feed ourselves, well, we feed ourselves a variety of foods to get all different nutrition. Okay? What we like most, what we eat best might be this one thing. My daughter would choose candy over any fruit, over any vegetable. And yet, to feed her whole body, to feed it well, she does need her fruits, her vegetables, her proteins. So, in the same way, as we're feeding our brains, even our bodies through knowledge, we need to do it a variety of different ways. Simply lecturing, like I explained I've done before, and expecting them to learn off lecture and reading, and then your assessment is just a test, is not effective and not realistic for your students to be learning. Providing multiple ways to engage with content helps support the full spectrum of learning. While a student may have a dominant intelligence or a preferred learning style, that does not mean that they learn exclusively through that approach. Learning is strengthened when information is presented through multiple intelligences and multiple instruction methods and assessments. For example, when teaching a respiratory concept, when I taught in the classroom, I did stand up in front of the class and give a lecture on the content, the hows. But beyond just the textbook information, I had lots of stories to share, lots of stories in my clinical practice or other respiratory therapists. And those stories now add to that knowledge and remembering it. And then also engaging the students in what are their stories. A lot of them were in clinical scenarios. You guys are all in clinical scenarios. What are your stories that go along with this content? Now let's add patient scenarios and get interpersonal. We already talked about the logical, factual, and readings information. We can add into that a PowerPoint slide that has diagrams for visual and spatial learners. Now what? Now what do we do with that information? I can practically show you how to do something. I have simulators for ventilators, or I also have real ventilators. Turn it on, show you what I'm talking about. And then getting hands on yourself, touching the ventilator, playing with the ventilator, looking at the ventilator, getting in clinical scenarios and situations. Those are those bodily kinesthetic learners. When you do your readings, you will read about the criticisms of the multiple intelligences theory. We've intertwined them here in this lesson. One of them we talked about pigeonholing or mislabeling people just because they have a specific strength. Another criticism is that there is weak evidence for the separate intelligences and the benefit of different teaching styles. So this is really relying on limited experimental evidence. Our second assessment, take a look at this video clip. This is Dr. Howard Gardner. And while watching this video, write down one or two quotes that you feel describe best Gardner's purpose of his theory of multiple intelligences.
We have schools because we hope that someday when children have left schools that they will still be able to use what it is that they've learned. And there is now a massive amount of evidence from all realms of science that unless individuals take a very active role in what it is that they're studying, unless they learn to ask questions, to do things hands-on, to essentially recreate things in their own mind and then transform them as is needed. The ideas just disappear. The student may have a good grade on the exam. We may think that he or she is learning, but a year or two later, there's nothing left. If, on the other hand, somebody has carried out an experiment himself or herself, analyzed the data, made a prediction and saw whether it came out correctly, if somebody is doing history and actually does some interviewing himself or herself, oral histories, then reads the documents, listens to it, go back and asks further questions, writes up a paper, that's the kind of thing that's going to adhere. Where if you simply memorize a bunch of names and a bunch of facts and even a bunch of definitions, there's nothing to hold on to. The idea of multiple intelligences comes out of psychology. It's a theory that was developed to document the fact that human beings have very different kinds of intellectual strengths, and that these strengths are very, very important in how kids learn, and how people represent things in their minds, and then how people use them in order to show what it is that they've understood. If we all had exactly the same kind of mind and there was only one kind of intelligence, then we could teach everybody the same thing in the same way and assess them in the same way, and that would be fair. But once we realize that people have very different kinds of minds, different kinds of strengths, some people are good in thinking spatially, some people are good in thinking language, other people are very logical, other people need to do hands-on, they need to actually explore actively and to try things out. Once we realize that, then an education which treats everybody the same way is actually the most unfair education, because it picks out one kind of mind, which I call the law professor mind, somebody who's very linguistic and logical, and says, if you think like that, great. If you don't think like that, there's no room in the train for you. If we know that one child has a very spatial or visual spatial way of learning, another child has a very hands-on way of learning, a third child likes to ask deep philosophical questions, a fourth child likes stories, we don't have to talk very fast as a teacher. We can actually provide software, we can provide materials, we can provide resources which present material to a child in a way in which the child will find interesting and will be able to use his or her intelligences productively, and to the extent that the technology is interactive, the child will actually be able to show his or her understanding in a way that's comfortable to the child. We have this myth that the only way to learn something is read it in a textbook or hear a lecture on it, and the only way to show that we've understood something is to take a short answer test or maybe occasionally with an essay question thrown in. But that's nonsense. Everything can be taught in more than one way, and anything that's understood can be shown in more than one way. I don't believe because there are 8 intelligences we have to teach things 8 ways. I think that's silly. But we always ought to be asking ourselves, are we reaching every child? And if not, are there other ways in which we can do it? I think that we teach way too many subjects, and we cover way too much material, and the end result is that students have a very superficial knowledge, as we often say, a mile wide and an inch deep, and then once they leave school, almost everything's been forgotten. And I think that school needs to change to have a few priorities and to really go into those priorities very deeply. So let's take the area of science. I actually don't care if a child studies physics or biology or geology or astronomy before he goes to college. There's plenty of time to do that kind of detailed work. I think what's really important is to begin to learn to think scientifically, to understand what a hypothesis is, how to test it out and see whether it's working or not. If it's not working, how to revise your theory about things. That takes time. There's no way you can present that in a week or indeed even in a month. You have to learn about it from doing many different kinds of experiments, seeing when the results are like what you predicted, seeing when they're different, and so on. But if you really focus on science in that kind of way, by the time you go to college, or if you don't go to college, by the time you go to workplace, you'll know the difference between a statement which is simply a matter of opinion or prejudice and one for which there's solid evidence.
Let's analyze and evaluate the current module for the various learning styles. We're going to go to week 1, and for those of you who are visual and spatial, I have both this PowerPoint, and we're going to go into the module for that visual spatial learning style. For those who are interpersonal, I always have my cup of coffee. All right, just starting at the first page of the module of the welcome, the focus, and an overview for what's to come. This is heavy on the linguistic verbal intelligence. Next page, week 1, overview. Those of you that are visual, can be audio, and just culturally, we're quite used to videos. I'm also hoping the way I present can be interpersonal a little too. I'll save you from it being musical. All right, our content page. What do you guys think? Which of our multiple intelligences do we meet on this page? There's several. You're watching this video here. So again, we're back to the visual, spatial. Hopefully within here, the way material is presented, it's logical and mathematical. The multiple intelligences quiz is very intrapersonal, knowing yourself, but also it can be body kinesthetic because you're actually working with the material, touching it, doing something with what we're learning. Reading in and of itself, you're reading these sources here, linguistic and verbal. Discussion boards. Discussion boards are a great way to meet that intelligence of interpersonal and intrapersonal. Interpersonal, you're talking with one another. You're learning from one another, discussing with one another. Intrapersonal, you have to know yourself well enough to communicate your thoughts. The week 1 assignment. Here's a real practical way to put together what we're learning. And this assignment is the beginning of a larger project that you're doing throughout the entire course. So that's very body kinesthetic, getting very practical with the content. So as I briefly go through the module, name some of the learning styles that are to be met and hit in there. Is there one that you look most forward to? One that you say, oh yeah, that one will probably be the most useful for me? That's a wrap on Howard Gardner's Multiple Intelligences. I'm going to leave you with this quote from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Some seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. Others seek knowledge that they themselves be known. That is vanity. But there are still others who seek knowledge in order to serve and edify others. That is charity.